Thank you so much for coming today. We have our wonderful second speaker for the Hemposium, Carol Ireland from Epilepsy Action Australia. If any of you are interested in medical cannabis, you might have noticed that there has been, I guess, walking hand in hand with certain medical conditions, and definitely epilepsy has been a medical condition that cannabis seems to have had some impact, particularly often for children suffering from, say, Dravet's syndrome. I think Carol's going to talk about how this new bedfellow has maybe helped raise the awareness of epilepsy in Australia. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, and good morning. So it's quite a few years ago now that I first heard about marijuana having claims of trying to assist people with epilepsy. Now, my team, people who work for me, are very conservative nurses. And they and I were really concerned, and we even delivered what we called key messages, wrote key messages, warning the poor unsuspecting public about marijuana and the fact there was no evidence to the fact that, to the statement that marijuana would help people with epilepsy. But a lot's happened in the last few years, the advances, the advocacy, the research, the changes to legislation. But for many families who have loved ones with intractable epilepsy or medication-resistant epilepsy or other chronic conditions, life-threatening and even terminal conditions, that progress must seem agonisingly slow and sometimes hopeless. For many, there's been no progress at all. Now, I won't talk today about the argument to legalise the broader use of marijuana. While I support that notion, I am focused on my patient group, people with epilepsy, and their need for therapeutic treatment. And I'm convinced that cannabinoid therapeutics offer an incredibly promising treatment option for people with epilepsy and many other conditions. So I'm the CEO of a national non-profit conservative organisation, yet sometimes when I speak I sound like a cannabis advocate. And I want to explain to you today why that is. I've met many parents of children with devastating forms of epilepsy, and my mantra, loving parents don't lie. Why would you give your child, your most precious thing in the world, why would you give your child cannabis? Particularly cannabis that is of unknown quantity, quality and so on. And then your child actually seems to improve and you tell people they improve. I mean, loving parents just don't do that. So, my mantra, as I said, loving parents don't lie. And I'm inspired, really inspired by some of the parents I've come to know. People who've done whatever is necessary to care for their child or the young adult. Why would they lie? Why would they break the law? So to set the context for my talk, I want to use some words about epilepsy from the World Health Organization. It is doubtful if there is any other medical condition so universally neglected due to a combination of social stigma, low profile and lack of resources. It is the world's most common serious brain disorder, but many choose not to disclose their epilepsy. There is a stigma attached to epilepsy. Isn't it ironic? The medical cannabis movement has raised the awareness of epilepsy in the community like nothing else. It's a strange story of two stigmatised subjects coming together. Now, on a personal note, I discovered the impact as a child of epilepsy growing up with an older brother who had epilepsy and an intellectual disability. But until I joined Epilepsy Action Australia, I hadn't known how many people face the challenge of epilepsy or how complex and varied it can be. Today, around 250,000 Australians are diagnosed with epilepsy. It's estimated that as many as 800,000 of us in Australia will be diagnosed in our lifetime. And I say of us because epilepsy doesn't discriminate. There are many causes and many forms, but any one of us could be diagnosed at any time in life. Now, approximately 60 to 70% of people actually will get a medication that assists or a combination of medications that assist from their doctors at the moment. Around about 30 to 40% of people, therefore, don't. They can't be helped, and they actually go on having many, many seizures, sometimes daily, sometimes dozens of seizures in a day, and in the really dire situations, sometimes hundreds of seizures in a day. And that's a pretty devastating condition, particularly if it's your child that might be having hundreds of seizures in a day, and their already compromised little brains are actually further damaged by every seizure. And for many, tragically, death might be the result for that child before they actually reach their adolescence. Now, for those of you that don't know our organisation, Epilepsy Action Australia, it's the largest and only truly national epilepsy organisation in the country, operating across Australia, delivering education, advocacy, support to children and adults affected by epilepsy. And as well as that, we do professional education in the community for doctors, nurses, teachers and others. With the growing awareness of the medicinal use of cannabis in the community, there's been a focus on paediatric epilepsy, raising curiosity and awareness of epilepsy. Now, why am I up here speaking? I'm not an expert in medicinal cannabis or in the regulatory process, and you'll hear some people speak on that today, but I am a representative of people living with intractable or medication-resistant epilepsy, and they've expressed serious concern about accessing medicinal cannabis within the framework of the Australian legal system, and securing medical supervision for the administration of cannabis. I can relay concerns and comments gathered from families with children with catastrophic forms of epilepsy, where the ongoing seizure activity limits their child's development and quality of life, and it impacts the whole family. So we know in the world of epilepsy that many parents who administer or want to administer cannabis are actually operating through what's known as the black market. And there is some justifiable concern about composition and quality of the product, the lack of medical supervision, and the legal implications. But some parents who've been told their child has limited time to live will risk anything, and understandably. I want to share a couple of the stories with you of people that I know quite well. This is little Suli Peak. Suli passed away in October last year. She had an unidentified neurological condition with intractable seizures. Her condition was considered life-limiting, but it wasn't considered terminal, one of the things that actually prevented the family from getting legal medicinal cannabis. They exhausted all medical options, numerous paediatric medications and even some adult medications, quite strong, difficult medications. The ketogenic diet, Suli needed to be tube-fed sometimes. She suffered regression. She was a normal little toddler and she suffered regression. She often needed to be resuscitated after receiving an emergency epileptic medication. The family found the only relief for Suli's seizures was a cannabis tincture that they received illegally. The compassionate supplier I've seen here today already, a lady called Jenny Hallam. The family didn't want to break the law, but they had exhausted all conventional medical treatments. Suli had a paediatrician, a palliative care doctor, a neurologist, and they all refused to give Suli a script for cannabis. The GP agreed that cannabis was helping no end, and the hospital administrator was sympathetic, but they didn't have the power to do anything. There was a lot of conflict and the family was threatened with the law when Suli needed to go to hospital, usually for something other than her epilepsy. You know, she had a virus or different things happening, and then she was not allowed to have her cannabis. Suli actually had a small lesion on her brain that had been monitored for a long time, and after using cannabis for a period, that lesion disappeared, and there was actually no explanation for why it disappeared. I had meetings with the Premier, the Chief Medical Officer, all of the hospital administration with her dad. There seemed hope, there seemed promise, and then all of that hope was dashed. They never gave up. They even had the help of a pro bono lawyer, and they were making progress, but unfortunately, Suli passed away in hospital. There is actually likely to be a coronial inquest into Suli's death. So the path to medical cannabis for people with epilepsy. News spreads really quickly amongst families with very disabled, very sick children. And in 2013, hope came in the form of Charlotte's Web, a designer strain of cannabis low in THC and high in cannabidiol. That's the component believed to control drug-resistant epilepsy. The patient who inspired this was a young girl called Charlotte Figge, and Charlotte had Dravet syndrome, a very devastating form of epilepsy. There was a lot of hope, and it came from early research results and clinical case studies overseas, and this was actually followed by anecdotal reports in social media here. But there were few research studies that used approved, and recruiting participants was difficult, so it was a slow progress. Parents in Australia, though, desperately sought to get hold of this. Now, in my role as CEO, I've had contact with a lot of families that are faced with the difficult decisions in managing their child's devastating epilepsies. I won't go into this in detail, but I'm sure you're all aware that medical cannabis was actually lawful in Australia until the 1950s, but then after years of prohibition, it actually was 70 or so odd years that medical research couldn't be carried out. So that's the background that we're working in. Now, I fully support the legal and medical pathways undertaken to provide medically prescribed quality controlled cannabis. I actually have a number of hats. I sit on a number of different government and non-government organisations, medicinal cannabis councils, and I try my best. I try my best to influence. Problem is, quality research and changes to existing laws takes time, and I think we just heard from the past speaker some of the difficulties around that in Australia. And unfortunately, time isn't something that many of these children and adults have. So, dire circumstances, they've been willing to try anything, and I see my role as first and foremost a patient advocate, standing there trying to influence for those patients. Again, I'm going to say, loving parents don't lie. These parents report immense improvement in the severity and frequency of their child's seizures and overall quality of life. They're using homegrown cannabis in some cases, they're using black market cannabis in some stages, in some cases. In some cases, they fly overseas. If they can afford it, they mortgage their homes and they go overseas where they actually can get a doctor to prescribe. Certainly, I know one young man at the moment who has a very severe brain tumour, and that's accompanied by epilepsy. And he was the first person in Australia to actually get approval for botanical cannabis. So cannabis in its natural state that he uses with a vaporiser. However, the cannabis that he got that shrinks his tumour, actually literally shrinks the tumour and stops the seizures, they've had huge difficulty over the past few years actually getting hold of that cannabis, and they're about to make, I think it's their third or fourth trip to the States. One wonders how many more they can actually afford to make. Okay, some families, as I've said, are growing from seed, and they're actually extracting, because that way they're quite sure that the cannabis they're using is without contaminants or pesticides. But again, time is of the essence for these kids, and despite the Therapeutic Goods Administration reclassifying cannabidiol, the non-psychoactive compound of cannabis, as Schedule 4, and THC and other cannabinoids as Schedule 8, illicit supply is still the only option at this point in time for many of these families. They have been and are still in a really difficult position, aware of the potential benefits offered by cannabis, but unable to access it. How many of you have actually heard that cannabis is legal now and you can go to your doctor and get a prescription? Yeah, most of you have heard that? Okay, so I would say that I know dozens and dozens and dozens of families, if not hundreds, that have actually not been able to get a prescription even though they've tried to do that. So the reality is they're still in the same position. I would say too that I've personally seen the changes in the lives of some of these kids. It's not that I've heard, I've personally seen it myself. And these families actually monitor their child, almost like a neurologist would, a specialist doctor would. They monitor the amount they're giving their child, they look at the improvements, they look at the side effects. They're out there flying solo, doing it themselves. And I want to introduce you to another of those children. This is 13-year-old Jai. Jai's from Brisbane. I think if you just have a little look at 2012, That was Jai on 35 legal tablets per day. A number of anti-epileptic medications, benzodiazepine, steroids, everything the doctors could possibly try to stop Jai's seizures. 2016, that's actually Jai 2.5 years seizure-free on a tincture of medicinal cannabis. But the story hasn't ended happily, unfortunately. It's ongoing. So, in Jai's case, parents often leave. They leave their local health service or they leave government officials, and they're full of hope about actually being able to get a legal prescription and help their families. Sounds so simple, but it's not, as I've already intimated. Now, Jai, at the moment, his parents are actually worried that he'll come out of the current protracted situation with his previous level of functioning that we saw back in 2016, or maybe even his life. Jai has multiple epilepsy syndromes and seizures. He also has a thoroughly medically documented case study of his intractable epilepsy with over 40 EEGs demonstrating the lack of efficacy or the lack of any meaningful medication that can be prescribed to treat his current situation. He has a record of multiple hospital admissions for unrelenting seizure activity. So in 2012, Jai was home from hospital for a total of 5 weeks in the whole year. Slight improvement in 2013, he was home for 12 weeks in the whole year. He had little quality of life, as perhaps even the photo tells the picture there. Each new medication actually brought new seizures and new side effects. Jai had multiple facial motor tics, weight loss, weight gain, unstable gait. He just had surgery because of some damage done to his hips as a result of medications. He had muscle weakness, excessive hair growth, hair loss, nausea, vomiting, insomnia, fatigue, vagueness, frustration, compulsive, erratic and challenging behaviours, excessive drooling, rashes, inability to regulate his bladder and bowel control and to regulate body temperatures. He had bowel blockages, constipation, loose bowels. He had increased anxiety. The list goes on and on and on. Jai wore a helmet when he could get up because he would fall all the time and hurt himself. He was basically wheelchair bound, however. He had multiple injuries, broken bones, broken teeth. His ability to communicate was minimal. His diet extremely poor. He choked often. His inability to sleep was poor. You can imagine the impact on his family, on his parents and his siblings. Most mornings they would wake to find Jai non-responsive, and sadly resuscitation was something that everyone in the family needed to know to actually save his life. So after nearly 5 years of what his mum Michelle calls being legally stoned, and despite an exhaustive list of failed medication, Jai's parents took the decision to become criminals. Jai's dad actually works in the Defence Force in security. So you can imagine how they spent a long time thinking about whether or not they should do that, but eventually they did what any loving parent would do. And they administered Jai a microdose of THCA. So THCA being, in its natural acidic form, something that wouldn't cause any psychotropic effect, but as I said, in a microdose of THCA. And within 48 hours of administering that cannabis tincture, his clinical seizures, those you could see, the convulsive seizures, stopped within 48 hours. Medical specialists in his records noted positive changes in Jai. He no longer required his helmet. His sleep and appetite dramatically improved. His levels of energy increased. Teaching staff, he went to school. Teaching staff noticed academic achievements. He wanted to learn. He wanted to socialise. I personally interacted with Jai during this period. He was active and thriving. He had only 4 breakthrough seizures between December 2014 and June 2017. And his anti-epileptic medications were successfully weaned. They were stopped. His EEGs continued to show great improvement, as did other neurological testing. And throughout the period, Jai's mother was very open about what was happening. Many of you probably remember Michelle from the last couple of years being here. Sadly, she's not here this year. She lobbied politicians, She spoke to anybody she could. She spoke to the doctors, always letting them know what was happening. However, there is unfortunately a however, using an unregulated cannabinoid tincture, it comes with risks. And there was an issue with one batch of Jai's tincture. It was believed to be contaminated. Jai became sick and it was immediately stopped. Jai went to hospital. He was hospitalised again and again and again because the seizures started again. He was landed in hospital and, of course, the doctors insisted that there was no cannabis given and they started him back on benzodiazepines and various other medications. He's a very, very sick boy. Jai's parents would describe the period on cannabis as being the best years of his life, but he actually had to go through that hip surgery I mentioned a little while ago. He couldn't go through the hip surgery unless he was cannabis-free, his bloods were being tested. It was really, really difficult. Now, they applied for the Epidiolex, which is the CBD preparation, pharmaceutical preparation that's being trialled in hospitals around the country now. He was actually refused Epidiolex to begin with. Why? Because he'd been seizure-free the previous 2 years. One of the criteria for getting the legal cannabis. He'd been seizure-free, he didn't actually qualify. Numerous meetings, I won't go into the long story, but numerous meetings, lots of lobbying. I think I personally wrote to everybody from the Prime Minister through the Premier to, speaking to people in Canberra, and his mum did as much and more, and eventually Jai was actually enrolled into the Epidiolex Compassionate Access Scheme. Didn't work. Sadly, it didn't work. So we don't know what the situation is for Jai at the moment. He's very sick. The doctors don't have an answer. That's him very recently on the right, my left, back in hospital again. He's not being able to go to school at the moment. He's not well and we're not sure what the answer is. Again, he and his family are leading what I would call traumatised and miserable lives. So where are we? Where are we now? With the stigma of epilepsy and the stigma of cannabis. As I said, Epilepsy Action supports any activity that would speed up legal access to medical cannabis products for research and for medicinal use. But we also would like to protect those individuals involved in the cultivation, manufacture, distribution, prescription, supply and administration of products right now. Protect them from prosecution and threat by government authorities, sometimes the threat to remove children from the care of their families. I've seen surveys that show that more than 90% of Australians support legalisation permitting the use of cannabis for medical purposes. On our own website, it's, our little survey tells us it's over 96%. So the public are in favour, but, what's the problem? There are hundreds, probably thousands, of people in Australia already using some form of cannabis for medical purposes. In a Sydney Morning Herald article on 11 October, Ian McGregor from the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics at the University of Sydney says he believes potentially 100,000 Australians are using cannabis to treat their medical conditions. But because it's illegal, we don't really know. However, in the last figures that I heard in terms of legal prescription of cannabis, there's some 500 people that have actually had access. For the other tens of thousands, illicit use, risks of prosecution, and all the complications that come with using an illegally sourced drug of uncertain composition, these people are criminals, and they're thousands of people with severe, unrelenting pain, children with intractable epilepsy, and people with other conditions for whom cannabis has possibly transformed their life. Yes, medical specialists can apply to the TGA to prescribe cannabis-based products, and they can get products under the special access and the authorised prescriber schemes. But that is so difficult. I mean, most general practitioners know little about cannabis. I'm actually involved in some general practitioner training later this month in Melbourne, and if that goes well, we'll actually take it to Sydney and various other locations. But at the moment, they don't know a lot. And anyway, they can't prescribe. If the GP wants to prescribe, they have to have a specialist, a treating specialist, at least endorse that prescription. Now, most specialists won't prescribe. Most of them are still saying there's not enough evidence. I would make the point that lack of evidence isn't evidence of the inefficiency or lack of efficacy of cannabis. But, you know, we've got that problem that they're still waiting for the long-term, gold standard, clinical placebo, you know, trials to be done. If you do find a specialist that's willing to prescribe, they actually need evidence for the TGA, evidence that is not readily available at the moment. And if approved by the TGA, they also require state approval of the doctor, and in some states, approval of the pharmacist that will be dispensing it. Now, if you can actually navigate all of that and you find a GP with a specialist approval or a specialist to apply, and you get state and federal agreeing, you know, that yes, this is reasonable, the cost. I had a mum from WA ring me 2 days ago. She's now got an adolescent with severe intractable epilepsy and other disabilities, and they've found that the CBD that they've been able to get approval for actually calms this child down to an extent that the family can actually take her out, which they could never do before. $38,000 per year, with dad about to retire. So they mortgage their house, or they actually deny the child that calmness, that quality of life. So, my final observations. First of all, the research is still in its very, very, very early phases in terms of getting a legal product. We're just at the beginning. I heard the last speaker talk about decades, and that's my fear too, that in terms of getting a legal supply of the right cannabis products, we are talking decades. Most of the data they have, most of the research that's currently available is from patients who smoked, and it is, or people who smoked, and it is from the harm and the addiction point of view that they use that data, as opposed to the medicinal benefits. There's a huge body of anecdotal evidence. I certainly know dozens, if not hundreds, of people, and some of them have documented very well what cannabis has done for them or their child, but that's considered anecdotal and not taken into consideration. And research is, let's face it, just a very slow and expensive process. So, as I said, my final observations, we've got a long way to go, unfortunately. Epilepsy is out there like never before in terms of awareness, and that's due to cannabis. It's an interesting journey that we're taking together, but still a long, long way to go. Have you each heard about the various states and territories claiming that, you know, their particular way of dealing with this is groundbreaking, ahead of all of the others, you know, the fabulous opportunities? I've heard it from each state and territory as well as the federal government. But there's a lot more to go, and I think a lot more robust discussion needed. My colleague again from the University of Sydney, Ian McGregor, says, let's rethink our strategy and make medicinal cannabis products readily available to Australians in need. I think that's true, and the last speaker again said, let's have a new conversation. That's how I heard it anyway, but it needs everybody's support. So thank you very much for listening. I wish I had a higher note to end on, but I think we've got to be grounded in reality.
Thank you so much, Carol. And we'll take a few questions. Don't get upset if we don't get your question. We have to stop it at a certain point. I just encourage everyone to talk to our speakers personally as well. They're here all weekend, so feel free to have a chat. First question over here, I think.
Hi, I'm Olivier. I'm curious, is there an action plan for scientific testing in order to get the product recognised officially?
Yeah, look, there are, but if you know a lot about medical research, it actually goes through a particular process. Now, if you think about it, starts in a petri dish, starts in a test tube, moves to animal trials, moves to human trials. By the time it gets to human trials, that's when we usually hear about it. We, the public, usually hear about it. At the University of Sydney, $34 million has been donated, but they're back in the Petri dishes and they've moved into the animal trials, not the human trials. So these things usually take decades and decades, and what's happened is the community has driven this forward in terms of cannabis. And the researchers and the government people, they're not comfortable with that. That's the term I hear all the time. They're not comfortable. It's moving too quickly. So there is research underway. The other thing to note is that medical research often starts with a single compound. Now, we know the cannabis plant has over 100 cannabinoids and all the terpenes and, wonderful things within it. And so a lot of the trials at the moment have started with a single compound. Cannabidiol has been pulled out, and they're doing some trials with cannabidiol. It's working for some, not for others. But if that's the progress and that's the process we follow, again, I'm going to say it's going to take decades before there's a range of products and we know exactly which products for which conditions. Slow, long, hard and costly exercise.
Why does the research have to be done in Australia when it's done in Israel, in America? In the scientific community, there must be so many trials done, and it's already there, and there must be literature on it. Why does it have to?
Yeah, that's certainly one side of the argument, and that many of us have taken up. In Australia, the government's very proud of its gold standard research. It's double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. So double-blind means neither the patient nor the doctor knows who's getting the cannabis and who's getting the placebo. And it's randomly allocated. And again, that's quite costly and quite lengthy research. But that's the standard that Australia is sticking to. And, we're collecting up, we and other organisations are collecting up whatever research articles we can find and trying to use those to influence. But the Australian model is slow.
Okay, any other questions for Carol? Oh, yep, we've got one here.
Hey, thanks for coming and speaking. I was just wondering when patients or parents for patients do get accepted for the scheme, how much roughly does it cost for what was it called, sorry?
The Compassionate Access Scheme?
Yeah.
That one? That one's not a matter of cost. If you're lucky enough to be accepted, and there is criteria,
I meant through the doctor's scheme, through the TGA.
Where there's an authorised prescriber, you might mean.
Because I seen on the news that there was a family using it for their daughter's epilepsy in Victoria, and it was costing them, I think, $600 for 6 days supply or something like $30,000 a year. Yeah.
In paediatric epilepsy, it's actually a higher dose required than for some other conditions. Higher dose, and at the moment it's cannabidiol. It's that one compound that's being used. And it's to do with weight. So, the older, larger the child, then the more expensive it's going to be. But it is a high level. So we're certainly hearing on average around 38,000. That's what we're hearing. And there's no subsidy, there's no thought of that ever being, going through the PBS, for instance, at this stage, because this is not registered product. It's been approved to bring into Australia, but it's not registered Australian product, so no PBS. Most families can't afford it.
Thank you very much, Carol. That's it for questions now, guys. If you did have any other discussions with Carol, please see her personally. Thank you very, very much for coming.